Thank you so much for your excellent panel. Dr. Driscoll, this question is for you. In your talk on Locke, you mentioned the idea that there can be such a thing as too much of liberty. I want to draw, it seems to me, that the problem is the lack of authority in the state of nature. That when you have this realm of total freedom, there isn't agreement about what the good of man is or what happiness is. If there were, how would you have war and conflict? So it seems like there is this moment of freedom, or you might say total freedom, that exists prior to society. How do you, isn't there a problem if you say there's someone who represents reason as such or has the knowledge of good as such, and there's disagreement on that point? How should we think about that question or that problem in light of?
So maybe I can try to restate what I take to be your question, which is, so the reason Locke says in the second treatise that you exit the state of nature is because it's unstable, because individuals disagree or come into conflict when they're trying to pursue their own ends. And so the presumption would seem to be then that we need to establish some sort of authority that will set limits to those things. And so then the question is something of, is there a tension between one who gets to decide what the common good is, rather than is it definitive that individuals have to give up their own pursuit of the good life as they understand it in forming this compact? Is that what I take to be your basic theme? Yeah. So I think there's a couple of ways to get at that question. The primary answer for Locke, I think, comes in that same chapter, in chapter 9 of the two treatises, second treatise, where he says, he gives this reason for why men exit the state of nature, which is that nature lacks the powers of government. There's no known legislation, there's no promulgated law, there's no enforcement, there's no independent judiciary. But at the end of that section, he says that while this may seem like a lack of liberty, the uncertainty of the natural condition is such that you don't actually get to enjoy your liberty anyway. In some respects, there's a sort of one could make a kind of analogy between Locke's argument there and the argument that Professor Habib mentioned from Montesquieu, which is the feeling of one's own security is lacking in the state of nature. And so when the individuals form the social compact, Locke says they do so with an intention to be better off than they currently are. That in some respect, that there's a lack of freedom in this ultimate sense of the sort of total autonomy to do as you wish, but that's not ultimately better. So there could be. Locke is trying to argue that for the most part, for most people, civilization is going to provide a better way of life than unmitigated freedom in the state of nature. This does, though, cause a potential problem for people who may not be satisfied by society, who may, to use Lincoln's phrase, or the family of the lion and the tribe of the eagle. Those are people who may not be satisfied by this program. That being said, Locke is firmly of the opinion that reason, properly understood, would point us in the direction of using our liberty in the ways he says. So the point of natural law is that these sort of things that we hold in common, that everybody wants their property, everyone wants to enjoy their freedom, and everyone wants to be secured in their life and enjoy their ability to associate with others, that's a sufficient reason to give up a certain degree of autonomy in that respect.
Can I? So Dr. Lippincott asked a question that I think goes to the heart of Montesquieu's contribution to Locke's project. So Book 11 and Book 12 in the Spirit of the Laws have to be read together, and they address your very question. And the title of Book 11 is On the Laws That Form Political Liberty. in relation to the Constitution. And then in chapter 12, on the laws that form political liberty in relation to the citizen. Unlike Locke, Montesquieu does not look at liberty outside of a constitution, ever. And the reason why Montesquieu would say the state of nature quickly devolves into a state of war is that there's no separation of powers. Locke gets there eventually. And so when he defines, he being Montesquieu, what liberty is, he says that in a state, in an actual state, not in a state of nature, that is, in a society where there are laws, liberty can only consist in having the power to do what one would want to do and in no way being constrained to do what one should not want to do. So, in other words, Montesquieu thinks I can get you Locke's ends: prosperity, protection of rights, the pursuit of happiness, the pursuit of property, but you can't do it beginning with an abstract principle about a liberty that exists outside of a constitutional order. Does that sort of address the question? Okay.
All right. Next question.
So this question's, thank you for everybody for your presentation. This question is primarily for Mr. Habib. So France has this incredible philosopher, Montesquieu, who clearly points out that liberty no longer is where you no longer have arbitrary abuse. He lays out the, separation of powers. He puts a huge emphasis on independent jury. Why did they have such inability to figure this out in the French Revolution?
Yeah, by the time, so the Spirit of the Laws has a running commentary on what's going on in France. It's subtle because he did critique a lot of what Louis XIV had done. In fact, it was a chapter originally in this book on the Romans that he withdrew because it was too obviously critical of France. And what was he critical of? The centralization of government. And so he withdrew it, and it's only recently been translated into English. It's called On Universal Monarchy in Europe. And if you read the Spirit of the Laws, you can see what he's getting at anyway. When he looks at England, it's a foil to what's not happening in France. And so in a way, you can see that the Spirit of the Laws is already predicting something like a French Revolution, and it's a warning to his contemporaries that there's way too much centralization. And then he ends his discussions on England warning the English that they could too go down that path. Because England, he says, and so quite often when you read big names on Montesquieu, they say England is his perfect model. That's not really true, because in at least two places he warns that England is already starting to show signs that it's weakening its intermediary powers, that England already is allowing the nobility to engage in commerce and undermining hereditary nobility. Montesquieu thinks a good constitutional republic should have a hereditary nobility that does not engage in commerce, but England is drifting in that potential direction. So he thinks England in his sort of romanticized version of it is far better than France, but France is heading down that path of potentially having a revolution. And so he, I think, foreshadows it in many ways. It was too far gone, too much centralization.
In what ways has our country developed too much centralization or?
Yeah, well, I would say that the biggest problem from Montesquieu's point of view would be the administrative state. Montesquieu's separation of powers, as he says in Book 11, is ambition checking ambition. It has to be accountable. It has to be elected. It has to be able to be recalled. And the problem with the administrative state is it starts to resemble the administrative state in Tocqueville's book on the French Revolution, where you start to see France essentially developing something like an administrative state run out of Versailles, where local political liberty is essentially non-existent. And what ends up happening is you have a generation of citizens who are no longer self-governing. By the time they've been stripped of any kind of freedom and the only game in town is an administration that has no direct relation to ruling, in that book, Tocqueville says, the French started embracing wild, radical ideas that were completely disconnected from reality. And so the fanatic character of the French Revolution grew out of people who had lost their local liberty. In America, in its founding, never had that problem. But you can see political extremism arising today because people feel that they're being ignored by politics, and it doesn't seem like representative government is really representing the consent of the governed. And again, Montesquieu in the same book 11 says the most dangerous branch of government to ever be corrupt is the legislative branch. If the legislative branch refuses to legislate and be held accountable for laws that they introduce and pass, whether through the judiciary or through its own representatives, he says then you will soon have an administrative state and have a despotism. And sadly, I think that's probably it's not a fault of the founding, it's the fault of rejecting the founding and introducing something like an administrative state. Montesquieu would say that this would be a very dangerous development in the American country.
In relation to your point about the decline of Rome based on its proclivity to empire, one could also make the same argument of America's national security state.
Oh, no
Which
question.
is, run away and unaccountable on the same grounds as the administrative state, but explicitly in the ways that Montesquieu says are problematic.
Yeah, I have to tell you, I mean, I don't know what grades you're teaching or if you do cover Montesquieu. All you need is just the first half of this book, just to see how a government is going to fulfill its principle, no matter what. So if its principle is constant war, it's going to become a military empire. And the problem is there's no way to check such a thing. That's the story of ancient Rome. Once it fulfilled the promise of its own principle, it became an empire, it became basically a military despotism. The principle directing you towards liberty, constitutional liberty, he thinks that there would be checks and there would be commerce, but it would be always in the service of making sure that the government branches are never corrupted by special interest. And he does mention, I know, but that I think is a scary development as well, what Mike just said.
We would need a revolt to insist on congressional term limits, possibly.
Yeah, no, I'd like that. Yeah, no argument there.
This question is for Dr. Habib as well, and it's kind of building on what you were just speaking about. It definitely seems like you're talking about Rome was not able to scale, and that you were alluding to that it got too big too fast. So I'm curious about how you feel about our current state as a nation, and do you think that we have unity of vision, which they seem to be lacking to a certain degree, and they couldn't define a citizen anymore? How do you think that relates to our current citizenship test? And then the whole continual warfare, do you propose more of an isolationism policy?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the tricky thing with Montesquieu is there's infinite qualifications to virtually everything he says. So in the book on the Romans, that kind of multiculturalism, for lack of a better phrase, was problematic to Rome because it did not have the scalable constitution to ensure that a diversity of thought and vision wouldn't end up cannibalizing itself. When you look at England, he says they can have religious toleration and religious freedom because the Constitution was set up to allow that kind of civic religion. And he says there you can have exactly what Rome couldn't have because its Constitution was directed at decentralizing public opinion, decentralizing any kind of religious or political authority. So the solution for Montesquieu is a constitution whose sole end and purpose is liberty. And he defines liberty as the conviction that the laws can never be used arbitrarily, but it's contingent on vigilant citizenship. He wants there to be active participation. He welcomes parties. He welcomes factions in the same way that the Federalists do. They don't want to squash factions, but they want to control their effects. They're deriving this from those chapters. And he says there, various opinions always keep your skin in the game, because if the balance of power shift at any time, then people could potentially lose what they deem to be liberty. For Montesquieu, this is actually a healthy mindset. The one thing that he warns about is that unlike the ancient world, commerce now is the sinews of war. So in the book on the Romans, he says the Romans were able to reverse engineer Carthaginian ships because they were so primitive. But in the modern world, you need an economy to be able to have a modern military. But you can't have an economy if you don't have a constitution of liberty. Because the other danger is the kind of economy Carthage had. And he says it was crony capitalism and it was predatory and it was really special interest inside Carthage. So on the outside, it looks like a commercial republic. As you go through the book, you realize it actually wasn't a commercial republic. It was a republic that was governed by oligarchs. It was oligarchic. And the constitution there served only those who were in power. So by the time you see England in the context of modern commerce, commerce in England, he says, they always put national interest and national sovereignty first. So he praises tariffs and protectionism. Now, Montesquieu recognizes that war is an inevitable and ugly part of politics, but he thinks that the best way to win modern wars is if you have the commercial industry capable of engaging war. We're no longer Rome. We can't, it's not easy to reverse engineer nuclear weapons. There are some parts of the world now that are starting to realize that their economic and political house are not designed for that. So they're fighting with primitive weapons against a mighty country that can have a military industry. With respect to citizenship, Montesquieu does think there are some limits, obviously, and he does think that England is a unique people. He does think that the kind of diversity that they do have, nevertheless, is anchored in the fundamental belief in their constitution. Where it becomes dangerous, like Rome, is when you no longer believe. It's John Jay. We share a common language, we share a common acceptance of the political principles. If you get to the point where there's just no agreement anymore on what those are, if it gets to the point where you have demagoguery and trying to do an end run around the Constitution, then you have that balkanization where you can't even define what a citizen is anymore. But England could always, at that point, America in its early period knew exactly what an American citizen was and was not. But when you get this big and when you have an administrative state and then people are not held accountable and you don't have representation, then you're replicating the problems of Rome at a massive scale.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your presentations today. Now, all of you were referencing primary sources in your presentations, whether it was Thomas Jefferson's letters, John Locke, or Montesquieu, and many of us gathered here today are educators of various levels, whether it's elementary school, middle school, high school, or even college. And many of us might be struggling with students, especially when it comes to reading primary sources. So I was wondering if you had any advice on how we as educators can teach philosophical documents that shaped the American founding. So do you have any strategies or advice on how we can engage students with these more difficult but influential texts?
I try to teach the Federalist to undergraduates year after year. I've done it for 25 years. They've gotten worse. They hate it more. It's gotten to be more and more of a challenge. I don't have a solution for it other than assign shorter and shorter passages and get them to develop the muscle memory, the muscle ability sooner. So I would say for high school teachers, incredibly short passages are necessary. And like in this case, the paragraph in the letter to Lee and the letter to Waitman, they're incredibly rich and they're also very different in what they say about the American Revolution. And so they invite speculation on what the American Revolution is or was. So things like that I think would be the way to do it. But it's hard.
I think actually, as a former student of Dr. Habib's, he does this very well. One of the probably one of the advantages, maybe piggybacking off of Dr. Bailey, is that you take those passages, but you should do close readings with students live in class and discuss the meaning of the passages. If you walk a student through some of this language, it is dense, it is difficult. We're not comfortable with it. As Dr. Bailey said, undergrads are not they're not all that much better, if at all, maybe worse. I've had we were in a class doing American political thought this semester, and some of the opinions that people took away from primary source documents that are not as difficult as Montesquieu or the Federalist, but were interesting. So I think there's a virtue to really the way I would think about it, the way I try to think about it with students is I try to just talk about, one is always trying to make things applicable to their daily lives. Obviously we need to teach the historical context, the arguments that were being made, the reasons they were being made, but we should analogizing it as best we can to something like today, the modern day, might be a useful way. But I'll submit to these guys with more seniority. I'm still a newbie at this.
Yeah, I get this question a lot actually at many institutions. It's unfair to use Hillsdale as an example because we get so many self-selected students. They come there precisely because they want to read the American founding. So I have to bracket that. But Hillsdale is not my first academic position. I've taught elsewhere, and I literally just gave a talk in Austin last week, and then at a school in Ohio. The same question coming up. Friends of mine who have applied for those positions always get the question from administrators who are hiring, how will you make this interesting to students? So I think you have to first diagnose what's causing the lack of interest. And I think it's because most students are just professionally driven. They want to study pre-professional programs. So here you are introducing Montesquieu and Aristotle, and they're wondering what on earth does this have to do with anything I'm doing? The difficulty of the text can be overcome if the passion for it can first be ignited. And so when I taught at other places where that was just not taken for granted, like at Hillsdale, you can just assume almost every student in there is dying to get to the US Constitution course for whatever reason. What I've always used to do was just motivate the interest in it by painting a picture of the relationship between ideas to their lives. So whether or not there's going to be a job for them out there because of AI, whether or not, during COVID shutdowns, which of course in hindsight none of them liked, you can tell them, was there any consent of the governed when that happened? You have to motivate the importance of self-government. And then when you ask them, do you feel that you have more security now or less than when your parents' generation was growing up? Prospects of owning a home, prospect of actually just expressing free speech. Young students realize that their speech is increasingly being restricted and they hate censorship. By nature, they're rebellious. And so Federalist 9 is the perfect way to begin that and say, well, the founders actually encouraged a very diversity of opinion. They found ways to control that while maintaining a consent of the governed. In other words, I think the challenge for most places today is that humanities and social sciences are under a lot of pressure to keep up with pre-professional programs. And for obvious reasons, schools are expensive. They're going to have debt when they get out. They already sense that their future prospects for employment are probably dwindling. And so you need to show first the urgency of why this country's principles were designed for the pursuit of property, the pursuit of happiness. And if they feel that that's becoming narrower and narrower, then these books and these articles that we teach become that much more interesting and urgent. I found that to be one way to get them interested in the close reading. But if you just start with the close reading, you haven't addressed why they're not interested in general. I don't know if that's helpful. But my first teaching job, everyone was in accounting, and there's nothing wrong with any of those professions, and they just looked at you like, I'm just jumping through hoops. This class, if it wasn't required, I wouldn't even be in here. And so you got to show them the importance of ideas to their lives.
Thank you.
I wanted to piggyback off of another question earlier. You mentioned, Dr. Habib, about one of the factors of the fall of Rome being the multiculturalism and also different gods. How would that factor into the American understanding of religious liberty? And I think you kind of hinted at it with the idea of a constitution being the thing that unites as opposed to a certain religious doctrine, because that was the issue with Europe and,
Correct.
All the Protestant Catholic wars was which religion are we going to be united by?
Correct. Yeah. So Montesquieu actually talks about religious freedom, but only in the context of England, because he thinks that if the Constitution is set up to ensure that no citizen has to fear one faction or the other arbitrarily gaining control, because that would then undermine the tranquility of spirit that makes up his definition of liberty. And in the passages on religious liberty in the spirit of the laws, he says even atheists will recognize that they should protect religious liberty, because one day the powers that be will go after incorrect religious views. The next day they'll go after theirs. And so he says, when the Constitution clearly favors the freedom of all and the Constitution, then everybody's invested in protecting the Constitution, even if they don't share the same views. And so, but the problem is, it's not in Book 11. You got to look at the parts where it's in. This is why if you're going to teach it and focus on England, you can't just do it with Book 11, Chapter 6. You got to look at Book 19, Chapter 27. Then you got to look at what he says in Commerce. Pull them all together and pretend it's one book. And there you'll see sort of a coherent take on how in ancient Rome, that kind of diversity without a constitution led to its demise, rise of demagoguery, factions. Because there were no nobody was looking at a constitution. According to Montesquieu, they didn't have the imagination to imagine a certain kind of separation of powers and a constitution that was actually serving everybody's interest. But it serves them as long as they promote toleration.
Yeah. Why was England a leader in sort of that religious pluralism that you mentioned? Could it be because of sort of the back and forth that they had with Protestantism versus Catholicism? Yeah. Could it be sort of the via media of Anglicanism? Did that have a factor?
You'll never believe what he attributes to, because I was shocked when I first came across it. Toward the end of Book 11, he says, and by the way, England got its representative form of government from the German tribes who conquered Rome. You're like, what? And because I had the same reaction, and he says, read Tacitus. And this is the very end of Book 11. And there's one other piece that Montesquieu thinks this is absolutely crucial to get. You're not going to get any kind of toleration unless you have indirect representative government. Rome didn't have that. England, he says, developed and refined a tradition that came from the German tribes that had conquered Rome. Now, you can believe it or not. I think it's a little bit exaggerated, but his basic point is that the Germans, who were the object of Tacitus's Germania, were able to conquer the Romans, but they tended to be tribal, but they united when there was a common enemy. If you look at those passages carefully, he describes a confederated republic without saying it. He says they were able to branch out into a large territory, but then because they were so jealous of their freedom, they knew they had to find some kind of capital from which to still govern, but they sent representatives. And he says, there's the origins of our Gothic constitutions. And he says, England was the one that took that and refined it. So the key, this is why Montesquieu is so hard to teach, because everything he says then gets qualified. You can't have that kind of liberty that we were just discussing without an indirect form of government. I think really the Federalists just get it. I mean, I've never read anything in the Federalists that I didn't already see in Montesquieu. I think they're really developing and refining and improving upon Montesquieu.
Thank you.
Yeah. And the reason why you want indirect is because he wants a system in which the laws and the process are impersonal and people don't feel like fanatics can get hold of their government. So if you just leave people a bit removed and have elder statesmen who are elected who can represent, but they're constrained by a separation of powers, it can get you the tranquility of soul that constitutes liberty.
So first of all, thanks for this panel, and it's a fascinating series of questions. My question is mainly for Professor Bailey and Professor Habib. Both of you have, and it's sort of a pedagogical question, I think, because it involves relating the world of the founders to our world. Professor Bailey referred to the tension between enlightened unanimity on the one hand and diversity on the other. So I'm interested in asking about what that diversity is. And you know, Professor Habib referred to Federalist 9, which deals with this subject as well. I mean, I guess I would put the question this way. What happens when diversity becomes a rejection of the basis of enlightened unanimity, that is reason? So in other words, when people begin preferring their own story, even if it's conspiratorial, and if that story becomes the basis of a sort of mini culture within the polity, does that, I mean, you could say that the quarrel over slavery involved this as well. I mean, that wasn't diversity of opinion, right? That was a rejection of, at least, you know, in Lincoln's terms, it would be a rejection of reason, the reason that tells you that all men are created equal. But it seems to me that because of a variety of technological factors like the internet culture, we're heading towards a situation in which rejection of reason is becoming increasingly inviting to large parts of the American culture on various political sides. So does this present, in other words, how would the founders' vision, how would Jefferson's vision in particular help with this, if it still can?
Yeah, so I'll just one sort of technical detail. You might have noticed this in my presentation. I speak less of the political thought of the founding than, say, particular founders. And so I don't know that there's a coherent theory of the founding that is accessible to scholars yet. More work has to get us there, like we're maybe 40 years from that. So just with that caveat, so speaking of Jefferson, so in his second inaugural, he does two things at the same time. He arrives at, let's call it a new libertarian theory of a free press, which would be familiar to us in a sort of post sort of John Stuart Mill world. It took him a while to get there, but this is a rejection of, say, the older Blackstonian notion, which was the basis of the Sedition Act. So he gives this sort of robust theory of a free press on sort of Millian grounds that we would recognize. At the same time, he's a scathing attack on anti-assimilation, sort of nativist Renaissance Indian leaders, who he calls anti-philosophists, who have an interest in convincing people to remain as their creator made them. This is meant to be a connector piece to this really interesting passage on assimilation, but it's also meant to be a direct attack on Federalist clergy and political leaders in Connecticut. And it's heard that way by his audience. Now, I say all this to say this, that in Jefferson, you see the struggle of someone who, on the one hand, was the target of a political, the Washington administration, who did not believe in, say, freedom of legitimate opposition or even freedom of the press in the way that we would take for granted today. And then they tried to persecute, imprison, fine, and worse, dissent. And Jefferson and his party create, a kind of liberty or diversity of thought in response to that. At the same time, Jefferson cannot imagine a world in which reason is not going to lead people to the same conclusion. And so that's why I said that in his view, the Declaration is going to flatten the world. And that is that there is going to be no more like serious religion. There'll be no more Baptists or Muslims or Catholics. We'll all be Unitarians. We'll all be Republicans. We will all live under certain axiomatic principles. And he'd be baffled by the fact that we haven't, right? And so that's, to me, that's the interesting sort of dilemma of thinking through Jefferson's thinking on these questions.
So two things. Montesquieu and Tocqueville. Tocqueville devotes 2 chapters, rarely to any one topic, but he devotes 2 to freedom of press. Today, it would be just freedom of speech. And he thinks that, and he's a student of Montesquieu, that America found a way, unlike Europe, to allow for massive disagreements in the public sphere. And what he liked about America is he said, that, this is a little dated, there's no national news here. This is fantastic. Because all of these different locations have their local opinions expressed in newspapers. There's no restriction on speech. He even says in America, there's so much fake news. I'm not kidding you. He's like, and you would think you want to censor that. He says it has the opposite effect in America. It allows there to be vigilance. It forces you out of just taking anything for granted, and then you can, so today it would be like social media. It's decentralized, and Tocqueville supported it because he thought it was a continuation of the project Montesquieu had envisioned, a constitution of liberty, where there's not only religious toleration, there's also political toleration of competing interests. His fear was that if you centralize speech in any way, shape, or form, this is Tocqueville, and he was an advocate of no censorship whatsoever, no matter how vile, no matter how, when you read it, it's striking, because you would think, he's like, well, you should censor something, and he says, well, the moment you start censoring, there's no arbitrary place where you could, everything becomes arbitrary as to when you cut off speech. It's exactly what Montesquieu says about freedom of religion. The moment you impinge upon people's freedom of religion, there's no, well, where do you then stop? And before you know it, you'll have a despotism. And both Montesquieu and Tocqueville believe that there's only two regimes where there's uniformity of opinion and there's general tranquility. He says in a despotism or in a people that have completely lost any political interest whatsoever. Instead, what you want, and here's what makes Montesquieu so interesting, if you want a constitution of liberty, you have to be prepared for a lot of public friction and conflict. And he says it's part of what it means to be actively engaged. So it's not a romantic view of liberty. It is a view where you have, if you like your liberty, you have to extend the same to others. That's part of being free and equal. But it's all contingent on a number of things. You have to have, this is again, not in Book 11, which makes Montesquieu so difficult. At the very beginning, he says that no republic can live and survive if its elections are interfered with. And he gives you ancient examples where they busted somebody interfering. So they brought him into Congress and had him hanged or something like that. They said, and Montesquieu says, now that's how serious they took elections. So you have to have safeguards on elections. You have to make sure that the consent of the governed is actually what's governing. The Federalist, you need an electoral college, you need massive representation. Then diversity of opinion, no agreement on any, then that's manageable. And in fact, a precondition for maintaining liberty because it keeps your skin in a game and keeps you vigilant. Both Tocqueville and Montesquieu fear more than anything an apathetic citizenry. And they can grow apathetic in a number of ways. If they just think it doesn't make any difference who you vote for, that's dangerous. If local decisions are being made by an administrative state, that is dangerous. If there's no more ability to express one's views, no matter how obnoxious, whether it's social media or in a newspaper, or if there's the nationalization of public opinion, Tocqueville's fear was then you can have elites manufacturing popular opinion and stripping people of their rights by influencing policy. So I don't look at diversity as a bad thing, and I don't mean it in the general way it's used. I look at it from a classical Republican view. You want that, but you want it channeled through deliberation and process and a separation of powers, because I've lived in parts of the world where there's uniform opinion, i.e. the Middle East, and that's hardly a place you would say is the land of liberty.
I might add just one note. Piggybacking off of what both my co-panelists just mentioned, there is a tendency to view the excesses of social media and the way that it kind of challenges this reason that you're alluding to. But as Dr. Habib just mentioned, in some respects, the arrival of social media was also a return to a free press, if you wanted to talk about that in a certain way. In the middle of the 20th century, when all communications are coming through cable news, but are regulated by federal communications regulations, there's a certain top-down micromanagement of opinion, which is where you get things like the sort of the take that was mentioned yesterday by Dr. Ellis in 1984 about this kind of groupthink that's promoted. So in some respects, social media could be seen as a way of a breaking of that. But so too, as educators, social media is also a useful way of figuring out what's on people's minds right now. It's sort of like reading a public newspaper. What are the kids talking about? And why is it happening? And so it's actually, it might be a good tool for educators to look into, as much as we ask about some of its other excesses. And then on a point of scholarly contention, Professor Bailey mentions that there's some disagreement about whether or not there's a consistent view in the founding. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention my teacher's book on this subject and Dr. Habib's colleague, Thomas West. So in the interest of secondary literature that may be useful to those of you who are teaching the founding, there's a book that West wrote in 2017 called The Political Theory of the American Founding with Cambridge University Press, where he makes explicitly the case that there is at least some consensus in the founding that can be seen and expressed through public documents, such as state constitutions and things like the Northwest Ordinance. So I just put that out there as maybe a resource for those of you who are looking at the founding.
All right, well, thank you very much to our wonderful panelists here. We now have time. Yes, give them a round of applause. We now have a break, and we will resume at 10:30 with our next panel on slavery and National Rights Republic.
Join us in falling in love with America again.